So, trig identities. This is my favorite part of trigonometry, but some people find it actually really difficult and frustrating. So, here's what's happening. You have all these trig identities. I'm not going to write them down here. You have them on a sheet. You have the reciprocal identities. That's one where you flip them over. Those are pretty simple for us. We have the quotient identities. Tangent equals sine over cosine. And then we have the Pythagorean identities. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, and so on. And so we're going to use these to help us find other trig identity or other trig functions in this video. We'll do proofs in the other video. So in this one, when we're finding other trig functions, first what we're going to do is we first identify what do we know, and then we identify what are we trying to find. So for this one, we're trying to find all 6 trig functions. Okay, so I need to fill this in. I've got sine equals, cosine equals, tangent equals. And then we've got the reciprocals, cosecant, secant, and cotangent. So fill in what I know already. I already know sine is 3/5. And then the reciprocal identity says I can flip that over and go 5/3. So that's easy. Those 2 are done. Usually you can get 2 done right away, right off the bat from there. Okay, so now I need to find the rest of them. If I look at my trig identities, the quotient identities has 3 trig functions in it, tangent, sine, and cosine, or the other one is cotangent, cosine, and sine. There's too many. We only want one unknown, and if we use one of those, there's too many unknowns. So then I'm going to go typically then to the Pythagorean identities. Now in the Pythagorean identity, if I have sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. I'm going to use that to help me find cosine because I already know what sine is. Now let's make sure we understand what sine squared means. When I have sine squared like this, it's actually supposed to be written sine of theta all being squared. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the sine with what it's worth, and then that is being squared. Okay? So I have 3/5 squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And so now I can solve for cosine squared. So first off, I square that. I get 9 over 25 plus cosine squared equals 1. Subtract 9 over 25 from both sides. So then we get 16 over 25. And then I need to know what cosine is, so I'm going to square root that. And we get cosine equals 4 over 5. So now I know the cosine value is 4 over 5, which means the secant value can flip over as 5 over 4. So this Pythagorean identity, this one right here, we're going to use that quite a bit. So just, become familiar with that one and memorize it. It'll help you out quite a bit. Okay, and then we have tangent. Now, tangent can be found a couple ways. Like, for instance, we have 1 plus tangent squared equals secant squared. So I know what secant is, so I could plug secant in there and go through all those motions. The one I like to use the most, especially when I know sine and cosine, is that, let me get rid of this here, is that tangent equals sine over cosine. That's one of the quotient identities. So tangent equals sine over cosine. And so then I can use what sine is, 3/5, over cosine 4/5. And since the denominators are the same, they cancel, and we get 4/5 as tangent. They lied. We get 3/4. Sorry about that. We get 3/4 as tangent. So tangent is 3/4. Flip that over, cotangent is 4/3. And so now we have all 6 trig functions there. So let's look at another example. Okay, here I have that cosine is 3/8, and I'm supposed to find sine and tangent. So let's first focus on sine, just because I remember that I have my trig identity, or Pythagorean identity, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And I know what cosine is, so I can replace cosine with 3/8, and that's being squared, equals 1. And so then we have sine squared plus 9 over 64 equals 1. Subtract 9 over 64 from both sides. So then we get 55 over 64. Square root both sides, and sine equals the square root of 55 over 8. Just a big one, but you know what? It is what it is. So I know sine is that. And now I need to figure out what tangent is, and we have a couple ways we can do that. We could say, well, tangent is sine over cosine, because now I know both of them. Okay, so then let's see, sine is square root of 55 over 8, and cosine is 3 over 8. Denominators are the same, so we get the square root of 55 over 3. Okay, we could have also used that, well, that would have been kind of silly to use, but what I'm thinking of is 1 plus tangent squared equals secant squared. And secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so I could replace secant with 8 over 3 squared equals, and then 1 plus tangent squared. And then we've got 1 plus tangent squared equals 64 over 9, and then I subtract 1 from both sides. So then that would be subtracting 9 over 9. I get 55 over 9, and then we square root both sides, and we get the square root of 55 over 3. Just like I got right here. So obviously, this one seems to be a little bit easier than the other one, but one of the things I'd like you to notice is there's actually more than one way to do these problems. It's just a matter of figuring out which identity you're going to use, which is, of course, the thing you need to practice. Because if you don't practice it, you won't figure it out yourselves. Okay? Now I have to find cotangent. Here's the thing. If you look at your identities, there is nothing that has secant and cotangent in it. But I do have an identity that says 1 plus tangent squared equals secant squared. And you might be looking at that saying, well, that doesn't really help me. But the thing is, I know secant. So I can plug that in. And the reason that helps me is once I know tangent, I just have to flip it over to figure out cotangent. So really finding tangent is the same thing as finding cotangent. So I'm going to focus on that, finding tangent. So we have 1 plus tangent squared equals 4. I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. So now tangent squared equals 3. Square root both sides. So now tangent equals the square root of 3. And that's over 1 because now I need to flip it over because cotangent is the reciprocal 1 over root 3. And then I can multiply this, or rationalize it, multiply by the square root of 3 top and bottom. So cotangent then equals root 3 over 3. So again, this might feel, I went a little bit fast maybe. It's just something you really, really have to practice. So when I give you board problems on these, you really need to practice those. When we don't even do board problems, the problems that you haven't even done in this section, you should practice those until you feel like you can identify things pretty quickly and that this video isn't going all that quickly. Then you know that you've got this down pretty well.